The road into isolation rarely begins in a wilderness. It begins in familiar places, among familiar faces, inside ordinary routines that appear stable and permanent. Throughout the biblical record, the individuals who would later carry significant responsibilities were not first distinguished by public recognition, influence, or power. They were distinguished by separation. Long before their names became associated with major events, they experienced seasons in which connections weakened, expectations collapsed, and familiar support systems disappeared. The pattern appears repeatedly across different generations, different regions, and different historical circumstances. A shepherd spends years in open fields away from cities. A dreamer finds himself rejected by his own brothers and transported far from home. A prophet lives in obscurity before speaking to nations. A future king hides in caves while others occupy palaces. The movement is remarkably consistent. Before the assignment becomes visible, distance emerges. Before purpose becomes clear, isolation expands. When viewed as a historical pattern, rather than an individual experience, the sequence becomes impossible to ignore. The people later remembered for their influence often traveled through long stretches of solitude before their roles became evident. Their loneliness was not merely emotional, it was geographical, social, and chronological. Entire years unfolded between the moment of calling and the moment of fulfillment. During those years, relationships changed, expectations shifted. Old environments could no longer sustain the direction their lives were taking. The deeper reason for this isolation was not simple rejection. It was preparation through separation. Human beings naturally adapt to the expectations of the environments around them. Communities create patterns. Families create identities. Cultures establish limits regarding what is considered possible. Yet the biblical narrative repeatedly shows individuals being moved beyond those limits. Such movement often required distance from the voices that defined their former lives. The result was a period that felt lonely from a human perspective, but served a larger historical purpose. Across deserts, mountains, wilderness regions, foreign kingdoms, and isolated territories, this process unfolded again and again. The loneliness experienced by these individuals was frequently the visible sign of an invisible transition. Their surroundings changed before their circumstances changed. Their location changed before their position changed. Their season changed before their destiny became visible. From the outside, the separation appeared like loss. From the broader historical perspective, it functioned as movement. Every major journey recorded in Scripture contains this principle. The path forward often required leaving behind a place of familiarity. The transition created uncertainty because the destination remained unseen while the former season had already ended. In that space between what was and what would be, isolation became unavoidable. The chosen often felt alone because they occupied territory between two realities. They no longer belonged entirely to the past, yet they had not fully arrived at the future. That tension produced a loneliness difficult to explain to others. Those around them frequently interpreted the season through ordinary logic. They saw delays instead of preparation. They saw absence instead of development. They saw distance instead of direction. Yet history reveals a different picture. The wilderness was not empty. The cave was not pointless. The exile was not meaningless. The waiting period was not wasted. Each location contributed to the formation of the individual who would later emerge with greater clarity, resilience, and purpose. Seen from this perspective, the real reason the chosen feel so alone is not because they have been forgotten. It is because transformation often occurs in places where applause is absent, recognition is limited, and companionship becomes secondary to preparation. The pattern stretches across generations and landscapes, revealing a recurring truth within the larger biblical story. Isolation is frequently the corridor between calling and fulfillment. What appears to be abandonment in the moment often becomes understandable only when viewed from the end of the journey, after the roads have connected, the distances have been crossed, and history has revealed the purpose hidden within the silence. As the historical narrative advances, another layer of this pattern becomes visible. Isolation did not merely remove individuals from familiar environments, it reshaped the way they understood time itself. One of the most difficult aspects of loneliness is not the absence of people but the apparent absence of progress. The chosen often found themselves living through extended periods in which outward evidence seemed disconnected from the promises associated with their lives. Entire chapters unfolded with little visible movement toward fulfillment. Seasons stretched into years. Years sometimes stretched into decades. Yet when the chronology of Scripture is examined carefully, these intervals become some of the most significant portions of the story. They were not empty spaces between important events. They were important events. The deserts, valleys, remote regions, foreign lands, and hidden places served as the setting where character developed beyond public observation. In many cases, the individual entered isolation carrying assumptions that could not survive the journey ahead. Ambition had to be refined. Fear had to be confronted. Dependence upon human approval had to weaken. Confidence rooted in temporary circumstances had to be replaced with something stronger. These developments rarely occurred in crowded places. They emerged during long stretches of obscurity, where external validation became scarce. This explains why loneliness appears repeatedly among those who occupy significant roles within the biblical narrative. The isolation was not identical in every case, but the underlying principle remained remarkably consistent. Separation created conditions that could not be replicated elsewhere. A person surrounded constantly by affirmation often lacks the opportunity to discover who they are when affirmation disappears. A person supported continuously by familiar structures may never discover what remains when those structures are removed. The historical journeys recorded throughout Scripture repeatedly place individuals in situations where former sources of identity no longer function. The result is discomfort, uncertainty, and frequently profound loneliness. Yet the same process creates depth. The chosen often feel alone because their lives are moving through a phase that requires internal development before external expansion. Looking at the geography of the biblical world reinforces this reality. Many of the most transformative moments occurred far from centers of influence. Mountains, wilderness regions, deserts, caves, and remote territories appear repeatedly as locations where major transitions began. These places were not chosen because they were comfortable. They were chosen because they removed distractions. They reduced dependency on public recognition. They stripped away illusions of control. In those environments, individuals confronted reality with unusual clarity. The silence that surrounded them became part of the process itself. Without constant noise, deeper truths emerged. Without continual approval, motives became easier to examine. Without familiar routines, new perspectives developed. The loneliness experienced during these seasons often reflected the distance between who a person had been and who they were becoming. Growth created separation. Transformation created tension. Movement toward purpose created temporary distance from those who could not yet understand the direction of the journey. History demonstrates that this misunderstanding frequently accompanied isolation. Family members misunderstood. Communities misunderstood. Leaders misunderstood. Even close companions sometimes failed to recognize what was unfolding. The chosen, therefore, carried a burden beyond physical solitude. They carried the challenge of walking through a season that could not easily be explained. The future existed before them as a possibility, but not yet as a visible reality. Others evaluated them according to present circumstances, while a larger process was already underway. This tension appears repeatedly across the biblical timeline. It reveals that loneliness is often intensified when external observers judge a season without understanding its destination. Yet the narrative consistently moves forward. The wilderness eventually connects to the promised land. The exile eventually leads to restoration. The hidden years eventually give way to public responsibility. The isolated servant eventually emerges into a wider assignment. The chronology changes, the locations change, and the historical circumstances change, but the pattern remains. The chosen feel alone because they are frequently traveling through territory that others neither recognize nor understand. Their loneliness is connected not only to where they are, but also to where they are going. The distance between those two realities creates a space that few people can fully share. Within that space, preparation continues. Strength develops. perspective expands. Identity becomes clearer. What initially appears to be a season of abandonment gradually reveals itself as a season of formation, hidden within the quiet corridors of history before the next stage of the journey unfolds. Eventually, the historical pattern reaches its conclusion, and it is here that the deeper meaning of loneliness becomes most visible. Looking backward across the timelines of Scripture, a striking reality emerges. The seasons that felt the most isolated were often the seasons that produced the greatest transformation. What appeared to be distance was frequently preparation. What appeared to be delay was frequently development. What appeared to be silence was frequently construction taking place beneath the surface. The chosen felt alone because they were living through processes that could not be accelerated and could not be fully shared. Certain journeys required personal experience. Certain lessons required direct encounter. Certain forms of growth demanded environments where distractions were limited and dependence upon familiar structures was reduced. History repeatedly confirms this principle. When the major figures of the biblical narrative eventually stepped into their visible assignments, they did not emerge unchanged from their periods of isolation. They emerged carrying greater resilience, deeper perspective, stronger conviction, and a clearer understanding of their purpose. The transformation was not accidental. It was connected directly to the environments through which they had traveled. The wilderness shaped them. The waiting shaped them. The separation shaped them. The loneliness itself became part of the journey. This does not mean isolation was pleasant. The biblical record never presents these experiences as easy. The deserts were real. The uncertainty was real. The losses were real. The emotional weight was real. Yet the larger narrative consistently reveals that those difficult seasons occupied an essential place within the unfolding story. Geography, chronology, and purpose intersected in ways that only became visible later. A person standing in the middle of the wilderness could not always see where the road was leading. Someone living through years of obscurity could not always measure the significance of what was taking place internally. Someone experiencing separation from familiar relationships could not always understand how those changes connected to future responsibilities. Yet when viewed from the broader perspective of history, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The chosen often walked through isolation because they were being positioned for something beyond their current horizon. Their loneliness was connected to transition. They occupied ground between departure and arrival. They lived within the space between old identity and new responsibility. That space was rarely crowded. It was often marked by solitude because transformation itself is deeply personal. No one can walk another person's entire journey. Companions may assist, communities may encourage, mentors may guide. Yet certain portions of growth remain individual experiences. The biblical narrative repeatedly acknowledges this reality through its depiction of long journeys across difficult terrain. Roads stretched across deserts, paths wound through mountains. Travelers crossed rivers, valleys, and wilderness regions. Along the way, moments of companionship appeared, but so did extended periods of solitude. These solitary stretches were not interruptions in the story. They were integral components of the story. They prepared individuals for the responsibilities waiting ahead. They exposed weaknesses that required attention. They revealed strengths that had not yet been recognized. They created space for clarity. Most importantly, they detached identity from temporary circumstances. The chosen often felt alone because the process was teaching them to stand firm even when external support diminished. This principle reaches beyond any single individual or historical moment. It appears across generations, across kingdoms, across landscapes, and across centuries of biblical history. The recurring pattern suggests that loneliness is frequently linked to movement. It emerges when one season has ended and another has not yet fully arrived. It appears when familiar structures can no longer support future growth. It intensifies when transformation advances faster than public recognition. The chosen, therefore, do not feel alone primarily because they are rejected. They feel alone because they are often traveling through transitional territory that few people understand while they are inside it. Only later does the path become visible. Only later do the connections emerge. Only later does the significance of the journey reveal itself. From the perspective of history, the isolation was never the destination. It was part of the route. The wilderness was not the final chapter. The cave was not the final chapter. The exile was not the final chapter. The waiting was not the final chapter. They were stages along a larger road that continued moving forward. When the narrative is viewed from beginning to end, the real reason the chosen feel so alone becomes clear. Their loneliness is often the evidence that a transition is underway, that an old season is closing, that a new season is forming, and that history is quietly preparing the next stage of a journey whose full significance can only be understood after the road has been traveled and the destination finally comes into view.